Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The autumn of 1881 brought an unusual chill to Salem, Massachusetts, one that seemed to seep through the very foundations of the town's collective memory. Dr. Jonathan Hartwell, newly appointed as the municipal archivist, had been tasked with cataloging the deteriorating documents housed in the basement of the old courthouse. It was tedious work, made more challenging by the persistent dampness that had warped pages and faded ink beyond recognition. Yet on the morning of October 15th, as pale sunlight filtered through the grimy basement windows, Hartwell discovered something that would forever alter his understanding of Salem's carefully curated history. Buried beneath a stack of routine property deeds from the 1820s, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow preserved its contents, lay a leather-bound journal bearing the initials E.C. The binding was cracked but intact, the pages yellowed but legible. As Hartwell carefully opened the cover, he found himself staring at an inscription that made his hands tremble. The private observations of Elizabeth Camp, Anno Domini, 1692-1693. The name meant nothing to him initially. In all his years studying Salem's documented history, particularly the infamous witch trials, he had never encountered any reference to an Elizabeth Camp. The official records spoke of Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, Martha Corey, and the others whose names had been etched into historical infamy. But Elizabeth Camp remained absent from every account, every testimony, every court document that Hartwell had meticulously reviewed during his academic career. The journal's first entry was dated September 22nd, 1692, written in a careful, educated hand that suggested its author possessed considerable learning unusual for a woman of that era. Elizabeth described herself as having recently arrived in Salem Village from the port of Boston, carrying with her what she termed certain knowledge of the natural philosophies. She had come, she wrote, at the invitation of someone she referred to only as the magistrate, though she provided no further identification of this individual. What struck Hartwell most profoundly was the clinical detachment with which Elizabeth documented the proceedings she witnessed. Unlike the fevered testimonies and emotional accounts that characterized other contemporary records, her observations read like those of a natural scientist studying an unfamiliar species. She described the accused women with neither sympathy nor condemnation, but with a peculiar fascination that seemed to focus less on their alleged crimes than on their psychological states during interrogation. The proctor woman exhibits signs of what the ancients might have termed melancholia, she wrote in one entry. Yet there persists beneath her distress a quality I cannot adequately describe, as though she perceives something the rest of us cannot. Something that brings her neither comfort nor terror, but a strange sort of resignation. As Hartwell continued reading, he noticed that Elizabeth's entries grew increasingly cryptic. She began referring to the work without explanation and mentioned conducting private consultations with several of the accused women before their trials. Most disturbing were her references to preparations being made for what she called the true reckoning, a phrase that appeared with growing frequency as the entries progressed into the winter months of 1692. The journal's pages revealed that Elizabeth had somehow gained access to the accused women during their imprisonment, though the official records contained no mention of any such visitor. She documented their physical conditions with medical precision, noting symptoms that seemed to extend far beyond the expected effects of harsh confinement. Several women, she observed, had developed unusual markings on their skin, not the supposed devil's marks that the authorities sought, but precise geometric patterns that appeared to have been deliberately created. Most unsettling was Elizabeth's growing conviction that the trials themselves were merely a prelude to something far more significant. "The magistrate grows impatient," she wrote in December of 1692. "He believes the preparations are nearly complete, though I have warned him that such haste may compromise the integrity of our endeavor. The women have proven more resilient than anticipated. Their minds bend but do not break, and this troubles me greatly. The final entries of 1692 spoke of Elizabeth's increasing isolation from the community. She mentioned that townspeople had begun to regard her with suspicion, though she attributed this to ignorance rather than genuine insight. They fear what they cannot comprehend, she wrote, yet they remain blind to the true nature of what unfolds among them. As winter deepened into 1693, Elizabeth's handwriting became increasingly erratic, though her observations remained disturbingly lucid. She wrote of dreams that seemed to bleed into waking hours, of voices that spoke in languages she did not recognize but somehow understood, and of a growing certainty that her work in Salem was approaching its culmination. Dr. Hartwell closed the journal as evening shadows lengthened across the basement floor, his mind reeling with questions that seemed to multiply with each page he had read. Who was Elizabeth Camp, and why had her name been so thoroughly erased from Salem's historical record? Dr. Hartwell's investigation into Elizabeth Camp's existence began the following morning with a methodical examination of Salem's official records. The Massachusetts Historical Society had long prided itself on maintaining comprehensive documentation of the witch trials. Yet, as Hartwell combed through court transcripts, property records, and church registries, he found no trace of the woman whose journal had so disturbed his sleep. The absence was not merely puzzling, it was systematic. In the margin of a court document dated October 3, 1692, someone had carefully scraped away a name with such precision that only the faintest impression remained in the parchment. When Hartwell held the document to the light, he could make out what appeared to be the letters E and C before the deliberate damage rendered the rest illegible. Similar erasures appeared throughout the records, always in contexts that suggested the removed text had referenced someone of considerable importance to the proceedings. More troubling still was what Hartwell discovered in the Salem village church records. The parish register for 1692 contained an entry for September 25th that read, "Received into fellowship by recommendation of the magistrate," followed by a gap where a name had been meticulously excised with a razor. The handwriting resumed with "woman of considerable learning in the natural sciences to assist in matters of spiritual discernment." The pattern extended beyond official documents. In the personal diary of Reverend Samuel Parris, housed in the archives of Harvard Divinity School, Hartwell found multiple references to the learned woman who had been consulting with the accused. Parris wrote extensively about his discomfort with her methods, describing them as too clinical for matters of such spiritual gravity. Yet whenever he seemed on the verge of naming this woman directly, the text had been altered, sometimes with different ink, sometimes with careful overwriting that suggested the changes had been made years after the original entries. The most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. While examining the personal effects of Judge William Stoughton, preserved in the basement of the Essex Institute, Hartwell found a collection of private correspondence that had somehow escaped the systematic purging evident elsewhere. In a letter dated January 15th, 1693, Stoughton wrote to an unnamed colleague in Boston, "The Camp woman's methods have yielded results beyond our most optimistic projections. The subjects respond to her treatments with remarkable consistency, though I confess her techniques disturb me greatly. She claims to have learned them during her studies in Prague, though she will not elaborate on the nature of her education there." The letter continued with details that made Hartwell's hands shake as he read, "3 of the accused have now exhibited the phenomena she predicted. Their testimonies have become remarkably coherent, almost as if they speak with a single voice. Camp insists this is merely the beginning, that the true revelations will come only after what she terms the final preparation. I have authorized her to proceed, though I pray God will forgive us for what we may unleash." Further investigation revealed that Elizabeth Camp's erasure from history had been deliberate and coordinated. In the personal papers of Cotton Mather, Hartwell discovered a document dated March 1693 that appeared to be instructions for the systematic removal of all references to the Prague woman from official records. The document, written in Mather's distinctive hand, outlined a methodical process for altering court transcripts, church records, and personal accounts to eliminate any trace of her involvement in the trials. Posterity must not know of her methods, Mather had written. Nay, the knowledge she brought from the old country represents a corruption of proper Christian inquiry into matters of witchcraft. Her techniques, while effective in extracting confessions, rely upon principles that no godly man should employ. Better that history remember our proceedings as guided solely by divine providence than preserve any record of her unholy contributions. The document included a list of names, prominent citizens, court officials, and clergy who had agreed to participate in this historical revision. Each had signed their commitment to removing Elizabeth Camp from the official narrative of the Salem trials. The list included Judge Stoughton, Reverend Paris, and nearly every other significant figure involved in the proceedings. Most disturbing was a postscript in Mather's hand. The woman herself has vanished, leaving behind only her journal and certain materials that we have secured. Whether she departed of her own accord or met with some other fate, I cannot say. Perhaps it is better that we do not know. As Hartwell pieced together this conspiracy of silence, he began to understand the scope of what had been hidden. Elizabeth Camp had not simply been a witness to the Salem witch trials. She had been an active participant whose methods had fundamentally shaped their outcome. Yet her techniques had been so disturbing to the authorities that they had chosen to erase her entirely from history rather than acknowledge her role. The question that haunted Hartwell as he locked away his research that evening was not merely who Elizabeth Camp had been, but what she had done that was so terrible that an entire community had conspired to forget her existence. The revelation of Elizabeth Camp's European origins compelled Dr. Hartwell to expand his investigation beyond Salem's borders. Through correspondence with colleagues at various European universities, he began to trace the shadowy path that had brought this mysterious woman to Massachusetts Bay Colony. What he discovered in the archives of Prague's Charles University would fundamentally alter his understanding of both Elizabeth Camp and the true nature of her work in Salem. Professor František Novak of the university's historical faculty responded to Hartwell's inquiry with surprising urgency. The name Elizabeth Camp, he wrote, appeared in the university's records from 1689 to 1691, though not as a student. Women were forbidden from formal enrollment. Instead, she was listed as an assistant to the natural philosophy faculty, a position that had apparently been created specifically for her. More intriguingly, her employment had been sponsored by a secretive organization known only as the Collegium Experimental. The Collegium, Novak explained, had operated in Prague during the late 17th century as a semi-clandestine society of scholars investigating what they termed the intersection of natural philosophy and spiritual phenomena. Their work had attracted the attention of intellectuals across Europe, including several prominent figures who would later emigrate to the American colonies. The organization's methods, however, had proven controversial even by the standards of an era when the boundaries between science and mysticism remained fluid. Hartwell's examination of the Collegium's surviving documents, painstakingly translated from Latin and German, revealed an organization obsessed with understanding the mechanisms of human consciousness under extreme duress. Their experiments, conducted in the basement laboratories of Prague's Old Quarter, had focused on what they called induced revelatory states, conditions in which subjects would allegedly access knowledge beyond their normal cognitive capabilities. Elizabeth Camp's role within this organization had been that of a psychological anatomist, a title that appeared nowhere else in contemporary academic literature. Her specific expertise lay in developing techniques for what the documents euphemistically termed cognitive restructuring. The methods she employed were described in clinical detail that made Hartwell's stomach turn as he read. Subjects were exposed to carefully calibrated combinations of sensory deprivation, herbal preparations, and psychological manipulation designed to break down their normal patterns of thought and perception. The Collegium's records indicated that Elizabeth had demonstrated remarkable aptitude for this work, developing innovations that significantly improved the effectiveness of their procedures. Her subjects, according to the meticulous notes she kept, achieved revelatory states with unprecedented consistency. More disturbing still were the reports that many subjects, after undergoing her treatments, displayed what observers described as enhanced perceptual capabilities, an ability to discern information that should have been beyond their knowledge. The organization's activities had come to an abrupt end in early 1692, when several of their subjects had died under circumstances that the authorities deemed suspicious. Elizabeth Camp had departed Prague just days before a formal investigation was launched, taking with her what the records described as essential materials and methodological documents. The Collegium itself had been disbanded, its members scattered across Europe to avoid prosecution. Professor Novak's research had uncovered one additional detail that sent chills through Hartwell's already troubled mind. Among the Collegium's correspondence was a letter from a magistrate T. Danforth of Massachusetts Bay Colony, dated December 1691, requesting assistance with matters of spiritual discernment that require expertise in the extraction of hidden knowledge. The letter specifically mentioned the need for someone skilled in techniques for revealing the true nature of suspected practitioners of maleficium. The connection was unmistakable. Deputy Governor Thomas Danforth, who had presided over many of the Salem witch trials, had actively recruited Elizabeth Camp for her expertise in psychological manipulation. The witch trials had not been merely a product of religious hysteria and social tension. They had been, at least in part, a deliberate application of experimental techniques developed in the laboratories of Prague. Hartwell's investigation into Elizabeth's European background revealed additional disturbing details. Church records from Prague indicated that she had been born Elizabeth Kratochvíl in 1665, the daughter of a physician who had served the court of Emperor Leopold I. Her father had been executed in 1683 for practicing what the authorities termed unnatural medicine, though the specific charges remained sealed in the imperial archives. Elizabeth had subsequently changed her name and sought refuge in academic circles, where her unusual education and natural aptitude for psychological observation had attracted the attention of the Collegium. The transformation from Elizabeth Kratochvíl to Elizabeth Camp represented more than a simple change of identity. It marked her evolution from a refugee seeking sanctuary to an active practitioner of techniques that blurred the line between scientific inquiry and systematic torture. Her work in Prague had refined methods that would later be employed against the accused women of Salem, turning their trials into a grotesque experiment in human psychological manipulation. As Hartwell absorbed these revelations, he began to understand that Elizabeth Camp's journal represented far more than a historical curiosity. It was evidence of a calculated campaign to test and refine techniques of psychological control, using the witch trials as cover for experiments that would have been impossible to conduct openly. The deeper sections of Elizabeth Camp's journal, which Dr. Hartwell approached with growing trepidation, contained detailed descriptions of the techniques she had employed during her time in Salem. Written with the clinical precision of a medical treatise, these entries revealed a systematic approach to psychological manipulation that was both sophisticated and deeply disturbing. Her methods represented a perverse fusion of the experimental rigor she had learned in Prague with an intimate understanding of the religious fears that gripped Salem village. Elizabeth's initial observations focused on what she termed baseline psychological profiles of the accused women. She had conducted extensive interviews with each subject, ostensibly to assess their spiritual condition, but actually to map their individual vulnerabilities. Sarah Osborne, she noted, suffered from chronic pain that made her susceptible to suggestions of supernatural influence. Martha Corey's fierce independence masked a deep-seated fear of social isolation that could be exploited through carefully orchestrated community rejection. The journal revealed that Elizabeth had developed a three-stage process for what she called cognitive reconstruction. The first stage involved the systematic erosion of the subject's sense of reality through a combination of sleep deprivation, dietary manipulation, and exposure to carefully crafted sensory experiences. The prison conditions in Salem, she observed with satisfaction, provided an ideal environment for this preliminary phase, as the cold, darkness, and isolation naturally weakened the women's psychological defenses. During the second stage, Elizabeth introduced what she termed interpretive frameworks, elaborate explanations for the subjects, experiences that gradually shifted their understanding of their own memories and perceptions. She would visit the imprisoned women under the guise of spiritual counseling, using techniques she had perfected in Prague to implant suggestions that would later manifest as confessions. Her journal contained detailed notes on the specific phrases and imagery that proved most effective with each individual. The third and most disturbing stage involved what Elizabeth called narrative consolidation. Working in coordination with the court officials, she would guide the accused women toward confessions that aligned with predetermined expectations, while maintaining the illusion that these revelations emerged spontaneously. Her notes revealed a chilling attention to detail, documenting how slight variations in questioning technique could produce dramatically different responses from the same subject. Elizabeth's methods extended beyond individual manipulation to encompass what she termed collective psychological architecture. She had carefully orchestrated the sequence of arrests and trials to maximize the psychological impact on both the accused and the broader community. Each confession was designed to validate and amplify the fears expressed in previous testimonies, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of accusation and validation that swept through Salem village like a contagion. The journal contained extensive observations about the physiological effects of her techniques. Elizabeth documented changes in the women's sleep patterns, appetite, and physical coordination with the thoroughness of a natural philosopher studying laboratory specimens. She noted that subjects who underwent her complete process exhibited what she called enhanced suggestibility states that persisted long after their initial treatment, making them ideal vehicles for whatever narrative the authorities wished to establish. Most troubling were Elizabeth's notes about the long-term effects of her interventions. Several of the accused women, she observed, had begun to experience what she termed persistent alterations in consciousness. They reported vivid dreams that seemed more real than their waking experiences, heard voices that provided detailed information about events they could not have witnessed, and displayed an uncanny ability to anticipate the questions their interrogators would ask. Elizabeth viewed these phenomena not as evidence of supernatural intervention, but as proof of her method's effectiveness. Her techniques had apparently succeeded in accessing and manipulating layers of human consciousness that conventional approaches could not reach. The women's confessions were not simply coerced admissions of guilt. They represented fundamental alterations in how the subjects perceived and interpreted their own experiences. The journal's most chilling revelation concerned Elizabeth's ultimate objective: Her work in Salem was not merely an application of techniques developed in Prague, but a field test for methods she intended to refine and expand. She wrote extensively about her plans to establish similar programs in other communities, using the lessons learned in Salem to develop more efficient approaches to what she called large-scale cognitive restructuring. As Dr. Hartwell read these entries, he began to understand that the Salem witch trials represented something far more sinister than religious hysteria or social conflict. They had been a deliberate experiment in mass psychological manipulation conducted by a woman whose expertise in human consciousness had been honed through years of systematic study and practice. The most harrowing sections of Elizabeth Camp's journal detailed her individual case studies of the accused women, documented with the cold precision of a natural philosopher dissecting specimens. Dr. Hartwell found himself confronting not merely historical accounts of injustice, but clinical records of systematic psychological destruction carried out under the guise of spiritual investigation. Each woman had been reduced to a collection of symptoms, responses, and behavioral modifications in Elizabeth's meticulous observations. Rebecca Nurse, the elderly matriarch whose initial resistance had frustrated the court proceedings, became the subject of Elizabeth's most intensive study. The journal revealed that Rebecca's steadfast denials had presented a particular challenge, as her advanced age and respected position in the community made her less susceptible to conventional manipulation techniques. Elizabeth had developed what she termed graduated disorientation protocols, specifically for such cases, involving the systematic undermining of the subject's confidence in her own memory and perception. Elizabeth's notes documented how she had exploited Rebecca's natural hearing difficulties, speaking to her in whispers that forced the elderly woman to strain and guess at meanings. Over successive visits, Elizabeth had gradually introduced subtle contradictions into their conversations, then expressed concern when Rebecca failed to remember details that had never actually been discussed. The cumulative effect, Elizabeth observed with satisfaction, was to convince Rebecca that her mind was failing, making her increasingly dependent on Elizabeth's guidance in interpreting her own experiences. The case of Sarah Good revealed Elizabeth's particular skill in exploiting maternal instincts. Sarah's desperate concern for her young daughter had provided Elizabeth with powerful leverage for psychological manipulation. The journal contained detailed descriptions of how Elizabeth had used carefully crafted reports about the child's welfare to reward compliance and punish resistance. When Sarah showed signs of maintaining her innocence, Elizabeth would hint at threats to the child's safety. When Sarah began to waver in her denials, Elizabeth would offer reassurances about protective measures being taken. Most disturbing was Elizabeth's documentation of what she called induced memory reconstruction in the case of Martha Corey. Through a combination of herbal preparations and psychological pressure, Elizabeth had apparently succeeded in convincing Martha that she possessed memories of events that had never occurred. The journal described in clinical detail how Elizabeth had guided Martha through elaborate fantasies involving nocturnal gatherings and supernatural encounters, gradually transforming these guided visualizations into what Martha genuinely believed were recovered memories. Elizabeth's notes revealed her particular fascination with the younger accused women, whose psychological flexibility made them ideal subjects for her more experimental techniques. Abigail Hobbs, barely 20 years old, had undergone what Elizabeth termed complete personality restructuring. The journal documented how Elizabeth had systematically dismantled Abigail's sense of personal identity, then rebuilt it around a new narrative that cast her as a willing participant in supernatural activities. The process Elizabeth employed with Abigail involved what she called controlled dissociation states, induced through a combination of sensory manipulation and psychological pressure. During these sessions, Abigail would enter trance-like conditions in which she became highly susceptible to suggestion. Elizabeth would use these opportunities to implant detailed scenarios that Abigail would later recall as genuine experiences. The journal contained transcripts of these sessions, written in Elizabeth's careful hand, that read like scripts for elaborate theatrical performances. Perhaps most chilling was Elizabeth's documentation of the physical effects her techniques produced in the accused women. She noted with scientific detachment how prolonged exposure to her methods resulted in measurable changes in the subject's appearance and behavior. Several women developed what Elizabeth termed compliance markers, physical symptoms that included tremors, altered speech patterns, and distinctive facial expressions that appeared when they were questioned about their alleged crimes. Elizabeth's observations extended to the women's interactions with each other during their imprisonment. She had carefully orchestrated these encounters to reinforce the psychological changes she was inducing in individual subjects. Women who had undergone her complete treatment process were strategically placed with newer prisoners to serve as what Elizabeth called conditioning agents, helping to accelerate the psychological breakdown of resistant subjects. The journal revealed that Elizabeth viewed her work not as torture or coercion, but as a form of therapeutic intervention. She genuinely believed that she was helping the accused women by providing them with coherent explanations for their experiences and clear pathways toward confession and redemption. Her notes contained frequent references to the relief subjects experienced once they accepted the narratives she provided, suggesting that Elizabeth saw herself as offering psychological comfort rather than inflicting deliberate harm. This self-perception made Elizabeth's methods all the more disturbing, as it revealed a practitioner who had convinced herself that systematic psychological manipulation represented a form of benevolent treatment. The final months of Elizabeth Camp's documented presence in Salem revealed a disturbing transformation in both her methods and her mental state. Dr. Hartwell observed with growing unease how Elizabeth's clinical detachment gradually gave way to something approaching obsession as her journal entries from early 1693 took on an increasingly erratic quality. The precise scientific observations that had characterized her earlier work became interwoven with personal reflections that suggested she was losing her grip on the very reality she had been so systematically manipulating in others. Elizabeth's entries from January 1693 indicated that her subjects had begun exhibiting phenomena that exceeded her expectations and, more troublingly, her control. The accused women were no longer simply responding to her carefully crafted suggestions. They were generating their own elaborate narratives that incorporated elements Elizabeth had never introduced. Sarah Good had begun describing detailed visions of future events that proved unnervingly accurate. Martha Corey spoke of conversations with deceased relatives who provided information about hidden family secrets that she could not possibly have known. Most disturbing was Elizabeth's growing conviction that her techniques had somehow opened pathways to genuine supernatural phenomena. Her journal entries became filled with references to unintended resonances and breakthrough manifestations that suggested her psychological manipulations had produced effects she neither anticipated nor understood. She wrote extensively about her subjects' ability to perceive events occurring in distant locations, their uncanny knowledge of other people's private thoughts, and their apparent capacity to influence physical objects through mental concentration alone. Elizabeth's attempts to rationalize these developments revealed the depth of her scientific training and the limits of her understanding. She hypothesized that her methods had somehow activated dormant capacities within human consciousness, comparing her work to the way certain chemical preparations could reveal hidden properties in seemingly ordinary substances. Yet her explanations grew increasingly desperate as the phenomena intensified beyond anything her European education had prepared her to comprehend. The journal documented Elizabeth's growing isolation from her collaborators in Salem's authority structure. Deputy Governor Danforth, initially enthusiastic about her methods, had become increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of her work. Elizabeth noted his reluctance to authorize additional sessions with the accused women and his insistence that the trials proceed more rapidly toward their conclusions. She interpreted his concerns as evidence of intellectual timidity rather than legitimate caution about the forces they had unleashed. More troubling still were Elizabeth's observations about the effects her work was having on the broader community of Salem Village. She documented a pattern of unusual occurrences that seemed to radiate outward from the core group of accused women like ripples in a disturbed pond. Residents reported vivid nightmares that multiple people shared simultaneously. Livestock exhibited strange behaviors, gathering in precise geometric formations that defied explanation. Children spoke in languages they had never learned, reciting phrases that Elizabeth recognized from her studies in Prague, but that should have been unknown in Massachusetts. Elizabeth's journal revealed her growing suspicion that her subjects were somehow communicating with each other, despite their physical separation in different cells. The women's testimonies had begun to converge in ways that suggested coordination beyond what conventional explanation could account for. They described identical visions, used identical phrases, and referenced shared experiences that they could not have discussed together. Elizabeth initially attributed this convergence to the effectiveness of her conditioning techniques, but gradually came to suspect that something more profound was occurring. The most unsettling development was Elizabeth's documentation of her own psychological state. She began experiencing the same phenomena she had induced in her subjects, vivid dreams that seemed more real than waking life, voices that provided information she could not have obtained through normal means, and an increasing sense that her own memories and perceptions were becoming unreliable. Her handwriting became more erratic, her observations less systematic, and her conclusions increasingly influenced by what she termed intuitive insights rather than empirical evidence. Elizabeth's final entries from February 1693 suggested that she had come to believe her work in Salem was part of a larger pattern of events unfolding across New England. She wrote of receiving communications from unnamed correspondents in other communities who reported similar phenomena occurring spontaneously, without any deliberate intervention. The techniques she had developed in Prague and refined in Salem appeared to have catalyzed something that was spreading beyond her ability to control or contain. The journal's tone during this period shifted from scientific confidence to barely controlled panic, as Elizabeth realized that her carefully planned experiment had evolved into something entirely beyond her comprehension or influence. The penultimate entries in Elizabeth Camp's journal, dated March 1693, revealed a woman grappling with the catastrophic consequences of her own methods. Dr. Hartwell found himself reading the final coherent thoughts of someone who had unleashed forces that defied both her scientific training and her capacity for rational explanation. The clinical precision that had characterized Elizabeth's earlier observations had completely dissolved, replaced by increasingly frantic attempts to document phenomena that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of nature as she understood them. Elizabeth's March 3rd entry described what she termed the convergence event, a night when all of the accused women in Salem's various holding facilities had simultaneously experienced identical visions. Despite being housed in separate locations with no possibility of communication, each woman had awakened at precisely the same moment and begun reciting the same sequence of words in a language that Elizabeth recognized as a dialect of medieval Latin she had encountered only once before. In the deepest archives of Prague's Collegium Experimental, The implications of this synchronization terrified Elizabeth more than any individual manifestation she had previously documented. Her journal revealed her growing conviction that her psychological manipulations had somehow created a collective consciousness among her subjects, a shared mental space that transcended physical boundaries and conventional understanding of human cognition. She wrote extensively about her attempts to sever these connections, employing counter techniques she had learned in Prague, but her efforts only seemed to strengthen the bonds between the women. More disturbing still was Elizabeth's documentation of her own involuntary participation in these collective experiences. She found herself awakening at the same moments as her subjects, sharing their visions and speaking words in languages she did not consciously know. Her journal entries from this period were interspersed with passages written in scripts she could not remember creating, elaborate symbols that resembled no alphabet she had studied, yet which conveyed meanings she somehow understood. Elizabeth's March 10th entry revealed her discovery that the phenomena were not confined to the accused women or even to Salem itself. Through correspondence with former colleagues from Prague, she learned that similar events were occurring across Europe, affecting individuals who had been subjects of collegium experiments years earlier. The techniques she had helped develop were apparently creating delayed effects that manifested long after the original treatments, suggesting that her work had fundamentally altered something in human consciousness that could not be easily reversed. The journal documented Elizabeth's desperate attempts to contact the surviving members of the collegium, seeking guidance for containing what she had unleashed. Her letters, copies of which she preserved in her journal, revealed a woman on the verge of complete psychological collapse. She wrote of her growing certainty that the experimental techniques developed in Prague had been based on incomplete understanding of human consciousness, and that their application had opened pathways to realms of experience that were never meant to be accessible to ordinary minds. Elizabeth's final coherent entries described her preparations for what she termed the necessary sacrifice. She had come to believe that the only way to sever the connections she had created was to remove herself entirely from the network of consciousness that linked her to her subjects. Her journal revealed detailed plans for a ritual that combined elements of the psychological techniques she had learned in Prague with practices she claimed to have discovered in ancient texts hidden in Salem's private libraries. The ritual Elizabeth described was both elaborate and deeply disturbing, involving what she called voluntary cognitive dissolution, a process designed to systematically dismantle her own consciousness in a way that would break the psychic bonds she had forged with the accused women. She wrote extensively about the preparations required, including the consumption of specific herbal compounds and the performance of mental exercises designed to fragment her sense of personal identity. Elizabeth's March 18th entry, the last coherent passage in her journal, revealed her final understanding of what she had accomplished in Salem. She had not simply manipulated the minds of individual women, she had created what she termed a prototype for collective human consciousness, a shared mental space that could potentially encompass entire communities or even larger populations. The implications of this discovery filled her with such terror that she viewed her own destruction as the only ethical response to what she had unleashed. The journal's final pages contained only fragmentary phrases and symbols that defied interpretation, suggesting that Elizabeth had indeed carried out her planned ritual. Whether she had succeeded in severing the connections she had created or had simply added her own consciousness to the collective network she feared, remained unclear from the surviving evidence. Dr. Hartwell's investigation into Elizabeth Camp's fate led him to a discovery that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. In the basement of Salem's oldest cemetery, beneath a section that had been sealed since the early 18th century, he found evidence that Elizabeth's disappearance had been far from voluntary. The municipal records he uncovered, hidden behind a false wall in the courthouse foundation, revealed that the town's authorities had taken decisive action to contain what they perceived as an existential threat to their community. The sealed documents, bearing the signatures of Deputy Governor Danforth, Reverend Parris, and Cotton Mather, detailed the events of March 19, 1693. Elizabeth Camp had been found in her lodgings in a state that the witnesses described as neither living nor dead, but suspended between mortal existence and some other condition. Her body showed no signs of violence or disease, yet she remained completely unresponsive to all attempts at revival. More disturbing still, the accused women in their various places of confinement had simultaneously fallen into identical states of suspended animation. The authorities' response revealed both their desperation and their understanding that they faced something beyond conventional explanation. Rather than seeking medical intervention or spiritual counsel, they had made the extraordinary decision to inter Elizabeth while she remained in this mysterious condition. The documents suggested that Cotton Mather, drawing upon his extensive knowledge of European occult practices, had convinced the others that Elizabeth's state represented a form of spiritual anchoring that maintained dangerous connections to forces they could not comprehend. Hartwell's examination of the burial records revealed that Elizabeth had been placed in a specially constructed chamber beneath the cemetery, surrounded by what the documents euphemistically termed protective materials. The chamber had been sealed with lead and marked only with symbols that bore no resemblance to conventional Christian iconography. More troubling still, the records indicated that the accused women had been secretly moved from their cells and placed in similar chambers throughout Salem's surrounding areas, creating what appeared to be a deliberate pattern of containment sites. The conspiracy to erase Elizabeth Camp from history had extended far beyond the simple removal of her name from official records. The authorities had systematically destroyed every physical trace of her presence in Salem, burning her lodgings, disposing of her personal effects, and even replacing the soil where her temporary quarters had stood. The thoroughness of this erasure suggested a level of fear that transcended mere concern about controversial methods or embarrassing associations. Most disturbing was Hartwell's discovery that the containment measures had not been entirely successful. The municipal records contained scattered references to periodic disturbances that had occurred at regular intervals throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Every 27 years, according to these carefully concealed documents, Salem experienced what officials termed resonance events, periods when residents reported shared nightmares, unexplained phenomena, and a general sense of unease that seemed to emanate from the sealed sections of the cemetery. The pattern had continued into Hartwell's own era, though the authorities had become increasingly sophisticated in their efforts to suppress public awareness of these occurrences. The most recent event, documented in files that were less than a decade old, had involved the temporary evacuation of several neighborhoods under the pretext of a gas leak investigation. The real cause, according to the sealed reports, had been a series of incidents in which multiple residents had simultaneously experienced visions identical to those described in Elizabeth Camp's journal. Hartwell's research revealed that Salem's municipal government had maintained an unbroken chain of officials who were aware of the town's hidden history and responsible for managing its ongoing consequences. Each generation had passed down the knowledge and the burden of containment, creating a secret tradition that paralleled the town's public identity as a site of historical tragedy and tourist attraction. The final revelation came when Hartwell discovered his own name in the most recent containment protocols. His appointment as municipal archivist had not been coincidental. He had been selected specifically because his academic background and psychological profile suggested he would be capable of handling the truth about Elizabeth Camp while maintaining the necessary secrecy. The discovery of her journal had been orchestrated, part of a carefully planned process to identify and prepare the next guardian of Salem's most dangerous secret. As Hartwell absorbed this final piece of the puzzle, he understood that his investigation had not uncovered a historical mystery, but had inducted him into an ongoing conspiracy that stretched back nearly 2 centuries. Elizabeth Camp's legacy was not merely a matter of academic interest. It was an active threat that required constant vigilance and management. The journal that had started his investigation now lay before him, no longer a historical artifact, but a manual for containing forces that defied rational explanation. Salem had not forgotten Elizabeth Camp. It had simply learned to live with the consequences of remembering her. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.